The emperor believed the battle was already won. He had the larger army, the heavier armor, the legacy of Rome behind him. Across the field stood an enemy he considered divided, inferior, temporary. What he did not see was that his greatest danger was already inside his own camp. The Byzantine Empire had survived for centuries by discipline and control. It believed order could tame chaos, that tradition could overpower adaptation. At Manzikert, that belief would be tested, not by force alone, but by arrogance, delay, and betrayal. The Seljuk Turks did not rush forward. They watched. They allowed the empire to advance, to stretch its lines, to commit itself fully. And while the emperor planned victory, his army began to fracture quietly, not in numbers, but in loyalty. This was not a battle decided by strength. It was decided by timing, by misjudgment, and by one moment when an order was given and not obeyed. By the end of the day, an emperor would be captured, an army shattered, and the gates of Anatolia opened forever. What followed would reshape the medieval world. The Crusades, the loss of Asia Minor. The slow, irreversible decline of an empire that once ruled continents. This is not the story of a single defeat. This is the story of how power collapses from the inside, and how one battlefield changed history for centuries. Stay with this story. Because Manzikert was not lost in a charge. It was lost in decisions made before the fighting even began. This is Battle Memoirs, and the fall has just begun. For centuries, the Byzantine Empire had mastered survival. While other empires rose and vanished, Byzantium endured, not through endless conquest, but through discipline, diplomacy, and control. It was Rome reborn in stone and law, an empire that believed order could defeat chaos. By the year 1071, the empire still saw itself as the center of the world. But history had already begun to move without its permission. From the walls of Constantinople, the empire looked strong. Gold flowed through the capital. Churches stood untouched. Ceremony and tradition continued as they always had. Yet beneath the surface, something fragile had formed. The empire's armies were no longer unified by identity, but by obligation. Generals competed for favor. Nobles whispered against one another. Mercenary forces filled the ranks, loyal only to payment. Strength existed, but cohesion did not. And cohesion, not size, decides wars. To the east, a new force was expanding. The Seljuk Turks, they did not arrive like an empire. They did not announce conquest with monuments. They moved fluidly, adapted quickly, fought without rigid formations. To Byzantium, this made them seem temporary, raiders. Nomads, a problem that could be corrected with one decisive campaign. This assumption would become fatal. Romanos IV did not inherit the throne through legacy. He took it through ambition, a soldier emperor, determined to prove himself worthy of Rome's mantle. He believed the empire needed strength, not compromise, action, not delay, and above all, a decisive victory to silence rivals within the court. Manzikert was not just a military objective. It was a political statement. Romanos gathered a massive army, regular Byzantine troops, foreign mercenaries, allies who shared no language, no faith, no loyalty beyond coin. It looked impressive, but appearances lie. The army marched east, not as one will, but as many ambitions moving in the same direction. The emperor believed authority alone could bind them. History would prove otherwise. While the empire mobilized with ceremony and certainty, the Seljuk leader Alp Arslan did something unexpected. He did not rush to confront the emperor. He observed, he listened. He allowed the Byzantines to advance deeper, away from supply lines, away from certainty, away from the comfort of control. Manzikert was not chosen by chance. It was chosen by patience. One side believed in order, tradition, overwhelming presence. The other believed in adaptation, timing, psychological pressure. Both believed they would win. Only one understood how wars are truly lost. The emperor believed he was marching toward victory. The Seljuks believed they were guiding an enemy into exposure. Neither side yet understood the full cost of the choices being made. But history had already chosen its battlefield. The army is assembled. The march has begun. The empire divides itself not by enemy action, but by its own decisions. This is Battle Memoirs, and the trap has not yet closed. From a distance, the Byzantine army looked unstoppable. Columns stretched across the land. Banners moved in rhythm with the march. Armor reflected the sun like a moving wall of metal. To observers, this was power. But inside the formation, unity was already cracking, not through fear, through distrust. The composition, an army of differences. This was not the army of old Byzantium. Alongside trained imperial troops marched mercenaries from distant lands, allied contingents with their own commanders, units loyal to rival nobles, not the emperor. They spoke different languages, held different loyalties, followed different expectations of command. Romanos IV believed authority would override all differences. But authority does not replace trust. The political shadow, enemies within the camp. The emperor did not march alone. He carried the weight of court politics with him. Several senior figures in the army had opposed his rise to the throne. They obeyed his orders, but not his vision. Some waited for failure, others quietly prepared for advantage. No swords were drawn, but allegiance was already uncertain. Strategy takes shape. Confidence becomes overreach. As the army advanced, reports arrived. Seljuk forces were present, but scattered, raiding, avoiding direct confrontation. To Romanos, this confirmed his belief. The enemy feared him. He pressed forward harder. Speed replaced caution. Depth replaced security. What the emperor called momentum, the Seljuks called exposure. The fatal choice, dividing the force near Manzikert, Romanos made a decision that would echo through history. He split his army. Part was sent to secure nearby territory. Another remained under his direct command. On paper, it made sense. In reality, it fractured coordination. Distance replaced certainty. Messengers replaced cohesion. The army was no longer one force. It was multiple forces hoping timing would hold them together. Seljuk observation. Let them separate. Alp Arslan did not attack. He waited. He watched the empire divide itself without pressure. Every mile between units was a gift. Every delayed message was opportunity. This was not passivity, it was patience weaponized. The mindset collision. Two understandings of war. Romanos believed control comes from command. Strength forces, submission order brings victory. Alp Arslan believed control comes from disruption movement, defeats structure, confusion wins battles. They were marching toward the same field with completely different expectations. Warning signs. Ignored and dismissed scouts reported Seljuk mobility. Messengers warned of enemy cavalry movement. But the emperor believed in decisive battle. He wanted confrontation, not shadows. The idea that the enemy could shape the battle without engaging directly felt impossible to him. History was preparing to disagree. The army is no longer whole. By the time the Byzantine army reached the plains near Manzikert, it was already weakened. Not by loss, not by defeat, but by separation. The battlefield had not yet spoken. But the conditions were set. No blows have fallen. No battle lines have clashed. The Seljuks begin to touch the empire, not with force, but with pressure that cannot be answered directly.
The battlefield did not erupt, it waited. The plains near Manzikert were wide, open, and deceptive. Perfect ground for an army that believed in formation and control. The Byzantine forces arrived expecting confrontation. But the enemy was not there.
At least not where they expected.
Instead of a clear line of opposition, the Byzantines encountered movement. Distant riders, dust clouds that appeared, then vanished. Scouts reporting enemy presence, then losing it again. No decisive clash, no fixed position. This unsettled commanders trained for traditional warfare. They could not measure what refused to stand still. The Seljuks engaged briefly, a sudden appearance. A quick exchange, then retreat. Not to escape, but to test. They probed the Byzantine response. How fast orders traveled, how quickly units repositioned, where confusion appeared. Each encounter was a question. The Byzantine army answered, slowly. Romanos the Force wanted battle, a clear enemy, a decisive moment. But every attempt to force engagement failed. Units advanced, the Seljuks retreated. Formations adjusted, the enemy dissolved. What should have been momentum became exhaustion. Confidence began to thin. As Byzantine forces pushed forward, formations elongated. Cohesion weakened. Cavalry units moved too far ahead. Infantry struggled to maintain pace. Communication became delayed.
No single mistake, just accumulation.
The empire was still intact, but it was no longer tight. Alp Arslan did not attempt to hold ground. He controlled movement instead. Where the Byzantines advanced, the Seljuks pulled them. Where the Byzantines paused, the Seljuks pressured the edges. The battlefield began to obey Seljuk rhythm. The empire was reacting, not deciding. Among the Byzantine ranks, questions emerged. Why would the enemy not fight? What were they waiting for? Was this a trap? These questions had no immediate answers, and unanswered questions weaken armies faster than losses. By evening, Romanos believed progress had been made. The enemy had been pushed back. The ground appeared secured, but what looked like success was actually permission. The Seljuks had allowed the emperor to believe the situation was under control. This belief would guide the next decision. As the sun lowered, Seljuk movements increased.
Faster, closer.
The battle was approaching its true form, not through collision but through timing. The Byzantines believed the enemy was retreating. The Seljuks believed the enemy was ready. Both prepared for the next phase. Only one understood what it would cost. The battle still has no center, no decisive clash. A single command changes everything, and loyalty becomes more important than strength. A battle finally takes shape. By midday, the field no longer felt empty. Seljuk forces appeared more frequently, their movements tighter, their pressure constant. What had been shadows now formed patterns. The Byzantines believed the enemy was finally committing. They were wrong. The imperial advance. Confidence returns. Romanos IV ordered a general advance. This was the moment he had been waiting for.
Infantry moved forward in formation.
Cavalry prepared to support the push. Standards rose. To the emperor, this was control being restored. To the Seljuks, this was the signal. The Seljuk response, the feigned withdrawal. As the Byzantines advanced, the Seljuks gave ground.
Again, but this time, the withdrawal was slower.
More deliberate. It looked like hesitation. It looked like weakness. It looked like victory approaching. Romanos pressed harder. The army moved farther from its original position.
Lines stretched, spacing widened.
The field was no longer neutral. It belonged to movement. The emperor's decision, the order to withdraw. As daylight faded, Romanos made a critical choice. Concerned about overextension, he ordered a controlled withdrawal back toward camp. This was not a retreat. It was meant to be disciplined.
Measured, temporary.
But battles do not forgive ambiguity. The signal misunderstood. The order moved down the line. Some units understood it, others hesitated. A withdrawal looks like defeat to soldiers trained to hold ground. Momentum broke, formation loosened, and in that moment of uncertainty the Seljuk struck. The flanks collapsed, speed over structure. Seljuk cavalry surged from the sides, not in one overwhelming charge, but in coordinated waves. They attacked communication paths, they cut off isolated units. They moved faster than orders could travel. The Byzantine center remained strong, but the edges began to disappear. The betrayal, a choice made. At the rear of the Byzantine army, a decision was made that history would never forget. Andronikos Doukas, commanding a reserve force, did not advance to support the emperor. Instead, he withdrew, not in confusion, but deliberately. Whether driven by rivalry, ambition, or calculation, his choice sealed the battle's fate. The emperor was left exposed. Realization, too late. Romanos attempted to regroup, but the field no longer answered him. Units moved independently, commands went unheard. Signals were lost in dust and noise. This was not collapse through destruction. It was collapse through disconnection. Dusk, control is gone. As night approached, the battlefield transformed. What had been an organized imperial force became scattered elements trying to survive. The Seljuks did not need to destroy the army. They only needed to ensure it could not function. And they succeeded, an emperor surrounded. Romanos IV was still fighting, still commanding, still believing recovery was possible. But the truth had already settled over the field. The empire had lost control of the battle, and control, once gone, does not return easily. The army is broken, but the story is not finished. Silence after collapse, the battlefield grew quiet. Not because victory had been celebrated, but because control had vanished.
Scattered units withdrew into the dark.
Some regrouped, many did not. The Byzantine army still existed, but it no longer functioned as an army. Manzikert was over. The emperor, captured, not destroyed. Romanos IV did not flee. He remained with what forces he could gather, still attempting command long after command had lost meaning. By nightfall he was surrounded, not humiliated.
Not mocked, captured.
The emperor of Byzantium, taken alive. This alone shocked the medieval world. Empires lost battles. They did not lose emperors. Alp Arslan's choice, victory without cruelty. When Romanos was brought before Alp Arslan, the expected cruelty did not come. There was no spectacle, no revenge. Instead, there was calculation. Alp Arslan understood something deeper than triumph. Destroying an emperor creates chaos. Releasing him creates leverage. The Seljuk victory was already complete. The rest was strategy. A treaty that meant nothing. Romanos was released under terms. Ransom agreed, territories promised. Peace declared. On paper, the empire survived. In reality, it did not, because the battle's true damage was not on the field, it was at home. The Constantinople, the empire, turns on itself. When news reached the capital, Romanos was no longer emperor. Rivals acted quickly. The Doukas families seized power. Romanos returned not to restoration, but to arrest. Blinded, exiled. The man who marched east to save the empire was discarded by it, and with him, unity vanished completely. The real defeat? Anatolia opens. Manzikert did not destroy Byzantium in a day. It removed the locks. Anatolia, the empire's heartland, its manpower base, its economic spine, was suddenly vulnerable. Seljuk tribes moved in, not as conquerors marching in columns, but as settlers filling a vacuum. The empire could not respond. It was too busy fighting itself. The ripple through history. From Manzikert came consequences no one foresaw. The permanent loss of Asia Minor, the slow decline of Byzantine power, the desperate appeals to the West, and eventually the Crusades. One battlefield reshaped centuries, not through destruction, but through imbalance. Final reflection: how empires fall. Manzikert teaches a brutal lesson. Empires rarely fall to enemies alone. They fall when unity breaks, loyalty fractures, confidence replaces awareness. The Seljuks did not defeat Byzantium by force. They allowed Byzantium to defeat itself. The gates remain open. The dust settled, the banners fell. But history did not move on, it turned.
Manzikert was not the end of an empire. It was the beginning of its unraveling.
If you want stories that go beyond dates and names, stories about decisions, consequences, and power, subscribe to ANA 247 TV. This is Battle Memoirs, and history still has more to confess.